Our goal for today is to have a good, honest chat about breaking down the barriers to climbing 512. And I really hope that what you guys can come away with are some really practical things that you can implement into your training and lifestyle and even mindset that help you get that much closer to your goals and hopefully sending hard this fall. I'm really excited to be here with Tyler. Tyler and I have known each other probably for about eight or so years, I think, since that first performance climbing coach, which has now grown into an international online training seminar for coaches as well as independent athletes. That's where Tyler and I met. Our mutual friend Steve Bechtel hosted the first one in Lander, and I've been a fan of Tyler ever since. And I think if I'd say one thing about Tyler and his approach to training, it's rigorous. He takes his game seriously, and he has a very rigorous scientific approach to thinking about the human body, thinking about performance. He leaves very, very little to chance, and I love that. I love that scientific rigor that you bring. So, Tyler, psyched for this chance to hang out, chat, share some secrets.
Yeah, man, always good. Always good to chit chat. It's more about being less wrong, right? Or trying to be less wrong. Because it's easy to let our intuition kind of lead us astray when it comes to training, because we're all maybe gluttons for punishment and we all like to do more, and it's hard to back off that enthusiasm for training when the outcomes are negative in the context of making us perform less optimal. So yeah, that kind of what drives me in that regard.
Yeah, right on. I mean, I think that all of training is such a mystery because the human body is so complex. There's so many different dimensions to training. There's a neurological aspect of the game and how the brain works and how the brain programs movement and force, how that delivery system into our tendons and bones works, and how muscles can power movement. There's so many different dimensions to thinking about physiology, and we're a part of a growing industry that will continue to evolve and continue to rethink how we train. So you're right, it's really about being a little bit less wrong every day.
Yeah,
and that's
sure.
what keeps it fun, is there is no one person that holds all the keys or all the answers. It's our curiosity and our engagement that just continues to drive us. So
right. Yeah, I'm a big fan of evolution in general, and studied that in undergrad, and that's typical approach to what have we evolved to do over this amount of time, and it kind of is really cool to apply that context because our organisms are so strong and resilient, and just like for the most part have the best interest in mind, have their own best movements and stuff in mind. But a lot of times we get in the way of that by trying to be overly complicated with stuff, so some of the stuff that I put out, a lot of times people think it's overly complicated, where it's like the physiology is always complicated, but it's really trying to use physiology to show that we're being overly complicated instead of we can be more simple with the stuff, and like do less things overall.
Yeah, I like that. I think that when I try to simplify things, I really come back to the idea that, like, if there's one thing that we know about the human system, it is that it's adaptable to the environment in which we exist. And that's true both in the short term in our lifetimes. Training is an environment. It's an environment that we choose to create to stimulate those adaptations in our body that kind of, just prods us gently in the direction that we want to go. But the part that I've really been focused on, what you touched on, is the idea of evolution. So now we're talking about the macro scale of that process. And human beings have 4 limbs. We look the way we do. We have teeth, we have hair, and all of these different things. They're all a product of the environment that we've evolved in, and how our system has compensated for that environment, responded to that environment, and created adaptations to that environment. So what I think makes climbing very intuitive to me is that climbing movement is the oldest, most original form of human movement, even before we actually became hominins and really diverged from other primates, we were climbers. That is our earliest, most ancestral movement habit. Even before we stood upright, before we hunted and learned to run, we had climbing, right? We climbed trees. And so in some ways, we're marvelously adapted to climbing. But then in other ways, modern climbing is so unique. The way that we load our fingers today is just so completely outside of the norm of what human beings on planet Earth have ever done, that it makes so much sense that we got to like disproportionately focus on our fingers, because, scrambling around and climbing trees doesn't involve heavy loading on our fingers in the way that we do today. So, yeah, fun to think of it that way. Kind of moving into our conversation for today, we're really focused on the 512 grade. And for me, I think of 512 as a climber. I think 512 is the biggest grade in climbing. And why I really feel that way is that it just encompasses so much climbing. And next week, we're going to release a blog that's my own personal reflection on the very first 512 I climbed, when I was really a 5'9" rock climber, but I found a route that was just perfectly suited to how I moved and climbed. And we all have those. We all have a 512 in our backyard. That could be our home project. But 512 goes all the way up to routes like Moonlight Buttress, Free Rider, iconic, biggest routes in America. A Free Rider, ironic, arguably is probably not even 512, it's probably 513, but most of the climbing on it would be 512. And for me, when I start thinking about that grade, I think not just about the difficulty, but I think, man, once you start to unlock 512 rock climbing across a variety of different styles, you've just blown the doors open to like so much rad climbing in this country, from bouldering to sport climbing, and then certainly to like some of the amazing big walls that we have. I'm going to throw routes like Rainbow Wall in there, much more moderate 512, but just if you've ever been into that amphitheater and looked up at the dihedral that splits this 1,500-foot wall, and you're going to climb just straight up that corner system, that goes at 512. Like, that's an amazing experience. Another route I'd throw on there is some of the most memorable 512s would be Beans Wall. It's on the west face of the Grand, and has two 512 pitches. One is a roof crack at over 13,000 feet that you campus out. It's about a 20-foot roof crack.
Whoa.
You're plugging gear as you go. Like some of my best memories in climbing are 512 routes. So 512 is not just about climbing hard. It's just about having access to like the best climbing and so much of it.
Yeah, it requires, I think, a bit more structured training for a lot of people. But again, you mentioned like the technical side or the different styles, where I was able to climb 512 relatively quick in places that are steep and overhanging. But even in the absence of having a lot of good technical skill, that just relied on a lot of strength. And Indian Creek is like that too. People get away with just being overly strong and not technical. But then when it gets harder than that, then you have to really focus in on your, skills as well, where yeah, for me, some of my favorites are Monkey Finger. Like, I don't know if you've ever been on Monkey Finger, but that thing
Nope,
is,
I know what you're talking about.
as well as like Moonlight. I've done that a bunch of times. And then obviously the north face of Half Dome, which is like the back-to-back dihedral splitter pitches. But yeah, I totally agree with you. Everyone, I think for the most part, has the ability to climb 512. When it comes down to the things that we're going to talk about, when they really want to cut out all the wasted stuff they're doing, I would say is the easy way of describing how to climb 512 is get rid of all the garbage, and then you will be able to climb 512.
Yeah, no, that's absolutely, I think, going to be a theme. And in a moment, Tyler and I are going to kind of split out and contribute like the three biggest things that we think are barriers to 512. I think that's absolutely going to be a theme, is like, removing things and reducing volume rather than necessarily adding a lot. But I want to emphasize, I really think that's so true, that like 512 is a grade that the non-superhuman athletes amongst ourselves, I'm a pretty ordinary athlete. I've had a lifelong training habit, and that's helped me achieve things that have been really outside of my range. 512 climbing is like that. Like, most climbers are going to be able to climb 512 in their lifetime, even if they start climbing older. You know, even if you start climbing your 40s, like you could absolutely achieve the 512 level. And what's fun about 512, I think, is that once you climbed a variety of different styles, you climbed some crack 512, maybe some, you know, traditional sport climbing style 512, some slab, you've solved so many problems in your climbing from like a mindset, from like a fear management and a training point of view. It really starts to open the doors to really like, okay, I'm a climber. Like I've solved a lot of the problems, a lot of the barriers, and I can continue to evolve. But when you get there, I think you've fallen in love with climbing. By the time you're climbing a variety of 512, like you're in, and that's just really fun.
It's good
So
feedback, right? It's like from the movement standpoint too, the positive reinforcement and the feedback is good for neural development. So people get that feedback and they want more, which is also really, really productive for climbers' progression.
totally, man, because I think that's, you know, one of the things with climbing, because it is a graded sport, we see progression in a way that we don't necessarily see in every sport. And when you kind of clue into the fact that, holy smokes, I have so much control over my physiology is so adaptable, my body is just like waking up every day going, hey, what do you want me to become? And then I do certain things and I become that. That's just like a very empowering human experience. I think that's so fun.
Yeah, for sure. Would you consider the V6 bouldering grade probably the same, right? Kind of like, seems to me like the barrier grade 2, where, you know, I feel like that's the same way with accessing really fun boulders and building confidence and skills too. So for the listeners.
Yeah, that's funny. I was actually going to ask you that because bouldering is so much smaller part of my life here living in the Tetons. We have great bouldering. It's just not easy to get to. And it's nowhere that you want to walk a pad to. So we tend to boulder a lot less. So I was going to ask you, yeah, what did you think that threshold is? Is that V6? Is that V8? But yeah,
when it comes to the climbing gym, for sure it's V6. Outside, maybe it's V5, but like in the climbing gym, for sure it's V6.
Interesting. Okay, right
And the
on.
same habit. So the cool thing for the listeners maybe is we're going to focus on sport climbing 512, but mostly I would say the same principles apply for bouldering at your limit too. You know, it's just a different work to rest ratio, but ultimately the same training habit flaws happen with bouldering athletes.
Absolutely. Absolutely. It's a very good point. So all of this is in conjunction with the release of our new 512 plan, which has been many years in the making, and it's a big upgrade on the original climbing plan that was really more oriented towards building a wide array of skill sets for the 511 climber. And we're going to drop a code right now that'll be valid for all of you who are on the call till the end of the day. It's Nelson20, and that'll give you 20% off this new climbing program that we're releasing that includes our new body weight program, which is a climbing specific body weight program that we've built into it. So check that out. All right, let's get into it, Tyler. Let's kind of go back and forth. I'll share, and I'm going to get you to go first, actually. Barriers to climbing 512. Number one, what do you think is what would you designate as your number one barrier that you see, both as a coach who's had so much exposure to so many different climbers, youth climbers, climbers of our age, and also as a personal individual climber, somebody who pursues his own passion for climbing? What's the number one barrier to people?
The one that I put was not being specific enough with your training. And so being specific enough, and that would be the climbing training. And a lot of times what I hear people doing is they're doing a lot more volume on different steepnesses or different hold sizes in the gym than they're actually training for outside. And when it comes to finger injuries or seeing performance gains, as one example, I talked to someone yesterday that's training for the Red River Gorge. And the Red River Gorge, everyone knows kind of the style, very steep, not small holds. And their coach had them doing 20 and 10 millimeter like hangs. And this individual is trying to break into the 511 plus 512 grade. And at that grade, at that crag, you will never grab onto those holds. And so when it comes to the training interventions, that is definitely one that's not going to transfer very well to climbing. And so I would say the easiest way for people to think about being what we term specific with their climbing training is try and make the training, the walls look just like the ones that you want to climb on, that you have goals on. The distances, the hold sizes, the steepness of the wall, how many efforts you plan on doing during a given session when you're there, how many sessions in a row you plan doing when you're there. Like that's another big mistake that kind of ties into this, is not training like on back-to-back days or every other day like you plan on training when you're at your trip. So I think that's a really big one. And I put as like a note for me, I used to lap 513 steep routes in the gym. It's pretty easy for me because it requires a lot of upper body strength. But then I would go climb something like Moonlight Buttress and wonder why I was getting so pumped, right? Because the walls are vertical and it's all in your feet and you don't have to pull so hard, right? And so that's a really big deal.
Totally, just the whole concept of specificity, and I think that can absolutely be a barrier that hits a lot of people at that 5'11 grade, where at the 5'11 grade you just think, I just want to be a better rock climber. And sometimes the best way to do that is to choose a variety of different climbing styles, but one at a time, and then really invest yourself in the skills, the energy systems, the finger strength specific to that one climb. Achieve that, do all the learning that you can do in that, and then transition to a different style of climbing and evolve sort of one thing at a time.
For sure. For someone that's trying to break into a new grade, being specific has a lot to do with all of those things. And if we try and do everything at once, you're going to get less of an adaptation that will transfer directly. Where to climb at Indian Creek vertical 512, you don't really need to be that strong, right? Where we all assume that we need to get stronger, so we climb steep terrain in the gym, but that's not the same kind of strength.
You know, my number one thing was too much volume. And in a lot of ways, actually, it totally overlaps with what you're saying. The thing that made me choose too much volume as my first barrier to 512 was remembering my own training at a time when we used to have a climbing gym here in Jackson. We haven't had a climbing gym for over a decade, I think now. It's crazy.
That gym was cool. That gym was good too.
Yeah, it was. It was a fun gym. Absolutely. I mean, it's nothing like the modern gyms of today, but it was a cool gym. And, you know, the guy who ran it was really primarily a boulderer and a really strong one. So there was a lot of like V6 to V10, maybe even a little bit above that level bouldering. But there was very little hard rock climbing or sport, you know, route climbing. And I remember, you know, I'd have climbed all the 511s. And then I thought, well, you know, I want to climb 512. So the way to do that would be to climb more 511s. So then I'd just climb 511 to exhaustion. And then soon I could, you know, climb them a few times. So then I thought, I know what I'll do next. I'll put a weight vest on and I'll climb 511 with a weight vest. Because by God, if you can climb 511 with a big backpack, then you can definitely climb 512. But of course, it doesn't work that way at all, because 511 with a monkey on your back does not enable you to hold on to worse holds, make bigger movements. It just causes more fatigue in easier movements. And volume can destroy so many of the outcomes that are so critical for succeeding at rock climbing. And one of the ones that I've really been very, very focused on as of late is movement. And movement, when we think about movement in the context of science, probably the word that best encompasses the science of it is really coordination. And when you look at the study of human movement and coordination, you see how incredibly sensitive our brains are to fatigue. And as you get tired, the quality of your movement, the ability of your brain to sequence a pattern goes down. And it goes down not just for that session, but for the subsequent sessions. In other words, you can destroy quality of movement by climbing fatigued. And what induces that? Too much volume, you know. And I think a lot of times when people hear too much volume, they think that means too many days a week, and it can mean that. But I think what I see more commonly, what I remember in myself, was like, I'm not going to leave the gym until I can't open my car door. Like if I'm not completely smoked and really fatigued and sweaty and my muscles are just bulging and my veins are popping out, like I just didn't get that good a session in. And that's something I think that still continues in our culture today. I think that general fitness culture is very much oriented that way, that like you gauge the value of your session based on how fatigued you are. That is just not a good idea at all in climbing. And I use the analogy of a buffet, right? Like if you go to a buffet, it's because you want a volume, you want a lot of food. But you don't go to a buffet to get like a fine steak or like the best lobster roll you've ever had. You just go there to eat a shit ton of food. And if you want to just crush yourself on volume, go ahead and crush yourself on volume, but you won't get quality. You won't improve in the way that you could if you're willing to train in a way that where your brain and your body can operate at its peak. And if there's one thing that fatigue does, is it destroys your peak, right? You recruit fewer muscle fibers. You don't have access to the same movement patterns. Too much volume can really undermine and destroy the quality of your climbing training in a hurry.
Yeah, I mean, there's plenty of research both for youth and adult climbers that say that is number one risk factor for getting injured. It's just climbing volume.
Right.
So
Right.
in addition to like, dropping your ability to be powerful and
Yeah.
coordinated at a given intensity, that increases your risk for getting injured. And I'll add to that, one thing that people do a lot with the climbing volume is they'll do a training session and they'll train their fingers afterwards. And so fatigue, as you know, is like not as limiting on passive tension as it is on active stuff. And so hanging is more like passive stuff on your connective tissue. So people can still do it, but those perceptions of effort from the fatigue really carry over. And it'll, I tell people like training habits are what get people not injured. No exercises. It's not like special exercises don't do anything. Training habits are really what gets people not injured, right? Which is all volume driven.
That leads us right into your second one, which was training and fatigue and that relationship. You want to talk about that a little bit?
Yeah. Well, systemic fatigue, like, the carryover from other activities into a training program. And, probably like you, the example I gave was when I was in college, I was going full time to school. I was working as a painter with my friend, painting houses. We would backcountry ski all winter long, work at night when the snow was good. And then every time I had extra time, I would be at school or I would be training at the gym. And so really, and then like trying to go to concerts and do the social thing as a college student. And what I ended up doing was just making my back sore all the time. I was just fatigued as hell. And no one had like the wherewithal to sit me down and actually go through all of the things I was doing and say, okay, get rid of that, or not get rid of, but modify those things to make sure I was actually recovering. Because even though something like painting is not that hard on my fingers, or hiking and backcountry skiing is not that hard on my fingers, the fatigue will carry over to other muscle groups. And that's relatively well studied. And so each session that you go in, if you're running and getting really tired, which is common, climbers like to run in general, or they're doing other activities, and they have these goals to climb 512, those other activities might be impeding your performance, right? And a lot of times, again, it's just the anxiousness of getting the stuff in, either for, keeping their body mass down or feeling like their fitness will carry over. But for the most part, things that are not climbing, just in general, are not going to improve your performance for climbing. It's just really that simple, but and it doesn't mean that they're all bad or you should cut them out. It really just means that they're a sacrifice that you have to assume is influencing your climbing in some sort of way.
Right. And, for folks out there who are trying to sort of figure out what that relationship is between the fatigue that I'm carrying over from my life, maybe from work or from other types of play, what we really can call that is central nervous system fatigue. And that's very different than like the fatigue that you would have in your local muscles from doing a sport. And I was actually climbing at the local cave last night with a friend. He's really young. He's in his early 20s. And he was talking about just starting to discover that whole concept of like central nervous system fatigue, which is sort of system-wide fatigue that really affects the brain's ability to flip the switch on your most powerful muscle fibers. And I remember that kind of breakthrough for me as well. I think I'd had a big day of backcountry skiing, and a friend of mine and I went to climb at Rock Springs Buttress. It was probably 15 years ago. And, you know, I remember checking in with my body and being like, no, I feel good. Like, I think I could do some rock climbing today. And I was so focused on the muscle sensation in the muscles that I thought would, I'm going to rely on for climbing. And they were fine because I'd been ski touring. But just like you said, there's system-wide fatigue that shows up in very different ways. That's going to have a massive, maybe arguably a bigger impact on your performance than local muscle fatigue. So
yeah, and those things, you know, they last a couple days. Like the real deficit that happens with fatigue is 2 days, you know, 24, 48 hours after. So again, that's a training habit thing. If athletes are going, you know, doing these activities where they're getting really tired and fatigued, and then they go the next day to do something very similar, like that just is a snowball effect. It just accumulates. And it's really hard to like pin down how much you can recover from because you don't know until a few days later. So you're already in the deficit, right? So it's like really finding that balance is really hard for the individual. That's why, you know, having some sort of structured plan obviously makes the most sense. You know, for myself as an example, the simplest thing I did to go from climbing V6 to climbing V10 was stop hiking. Like I didn't, because I love hiking and I love alpine stuff, but I'm someone that gets big legs. Like if I do that, like my legs get heavy and I get big and I get tired from doing it and I like doing it. My life is busy. And so I stopped doing those things for 2 summers and it was super lame. And I was like, just really focused in, but that's pretty much what I did. And like, it was massively helpful about how much effort I could give every session, either inside or outside, right? Something so simple can be so profound.
this is one of those places where I think we call it old man strength. You know, I'm in my mid 40s now. And one thing that I've got going over my younger self and over a lot of my younger friends is I just know my body so much better. And I can read fatigue. I can sense fatigue from the moment I open my eyelids in the morning. And my ability to like be so much better interpreter of my own physiology has a huge impact on my climbing. And I know, like, as much as you might want it, today's not the day to go and try hard. Maybe today's not the day to go climbing at all. My younger self would have had to rely on a plan and a structure and what somebody else was telling me. So for all of you old guys and gals out there like me, you know, rely and trust that like deep intuition that you have about your own body that you developed as an athlete who's done maybe many other things apart from climbing, but you've learned to say, hey, this sensation means this. When I feel like this, I know this. And that's something that we get with time in our bodies, you know. So that's old man strength right there.
For sure.
Okay, great. I'm going to say for my number 2 is poor tactics. And this is a mindset thing. This is a mindset thing, in my opinion. And I see this going in 2 different directions, and I've been guilty of both of them. So one direction that it goes in is the self-sabotaging athlete. They don't tie their shoelaces. I had to have a little talk with my young friend who brought his TC Pros to the cave. You know, you don't bring your TC Pros to the cave.
You think mom comes to the cave, dog?
You know, refusing to stick clip, just different things that you, this is the mindset that underpins it that I hear a lot is like, man, I'm not good enough for it to matter. That's not a thing. Like, that's not a thing. We're all good enough for it to matter. Okay. We're all good enough for it to matter. And you can either be a person of a mindset that says, my game is to stack all the cards in my favor to set myself up to do my level best work today. Or you can say, man, none of that shit matters. I am who I am, and I'm going to do all these things that better climbers would never do because I don't believe in myself. I don't think it's going to matter. I promise you it does matter, but it's a mindset shift to moving away from that self-sabotaging approach, and really saying, yeah, maybe I am a 5'9" climber, maybe I'm a 5'12" climber, but what I can do today is show up and give myself every damn advantage I can to grab this rock, start on the ground and make it all the way to the chains. Do all those things that you think are going to contribute. If you think that like taking your shoes off and resting for another 10 minutes is what it takes, absolutely do that, because 10 minutes of rest could dramatically increase or decrease the chances of you having the performance that you need to make it to the chains. So sometimes it's that self-sabotaging approach. And I was totally guilty of that early in my climbing career because, you know, I came from more of a trad climbing background, where we don't use those kinds of tactics because we're not actually doing it. You know, in my early days, I wasn't actually doing hard climbing. I was doing scary climbing. So it was really about just like getting the right mindset. But you know, the shoes that I wore and the chalk that I used and the this that, you know, rehearsing the route and those types of things weren't a part of my repertoire. Then when I started climbing in Lander, I really didn't have the tactics and I didn't have the mindset of like, no, this is me showing up as my best self to do my best rock climbing. And that when I understood that, that was definitely a bump. The other sort of opposite mindset that I think is like the modern tendency is I'm too good for that. It's sort of the opposite. And now I see a lot of like, you go to a crag, you see young people, they're projecting routes, but we get so obsessed with grades that instead of embracing climbing for the challenge that it is, we get obsessed with the grade. And so we say, well, you know, hey, I'm a 5'11 climber and I fell on the 5'10A warm-up, but I'm too embarrassed and I'm too good for it. I'm not going to go again. I absolutely had that mindset. I was like, I'm a 5'11 climber. I'm not going to waste time on this easy 5'10. It's like, did you climb it? Did you send it? Were you successful at it? And if the answer is no, then like absolutely go back and let the rock teach you what it has to teach you. Let your body learn what it has to learn. And I learned that from this friend of mine, Ty Mack, who's the best rock climber I've ever tied in with. He's a legend in Lander. He lives in Teton Valley now. We haven't climbed for years, but I learned a lot about climbing from him. He's a guy who's climbed 514. He sent free rider like 15 years ago. And I remember climbing at Rock Springs with him and he fell off this 12A, which is a very easy grade for him. And I went to do my route and I was wondering what he was going to do next because he fell off the warm-up. I figured he'd just move on to something hard. No. He's like, no, I'll never leave something like that undone. If I fell off, it's because I got something to learn. And that was like a light bulb moment for me where I was like, oh yeah, I see how my ego can get attached to grades. I'm not a very good slab climber. I get really uncomfortable on slabs. So like I might have to put a lot of time in on lower grade slabs and embrace that the rock still has something to teach me, even if the grade doesn't necessarily reflect it. So all of that for me falls into tactics and mindset. I think those are big barriers to 512 success.
Yeah, I think that's cool. I love that. I wrote some things down just while I was thinking about it. Like, I think the tactics things are lifestyle too, just so we can be comprehensive with it, right? Where you can't expect yourself to have all those things in place and show up hungover from the night before. You know, so like nutritional tactics, mine were shit when we climbed in Indian Creek when I was in college. We would take a block of cheese and some beef jerky. And that's like the worst possible fuel for like your climbing during the day, right? Thank goodness we had PBR, so it was like we had some sort of carbohydrate. But ultimately, like the nutritional tactics are so important because if you don't set yourself up for success, you know, like the chances, like just from the numbers game, right? For athletes that are really considerate about what they want to do and they have these goals, like you want to get everything in line. That's the other thing that I did for my performance for bouldering. I stopped drinking completely for a couple of years. Like, and after I haven't done it, I'm like, oh, cool. I just don't really care anymore. Right. But those things over slow periods of time, like building finger strength, will pay big dividends in the future for people.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. We can self-sabotage ourselves in the way that we live our lives and then expect to show up as our best athletic selves. And that's not gonna work. So 100%. Cool. Tyler, your third one. Well,
Let's see.
So we're right on track. I think we'll probably be done in about 10 minutes. Tyler, your third one, totally unsurprisingly for you, is not loading your fingers year round. So talk to us about finger loading.
Yeah, so for me, I was thinking of when we would go to Yosemite in the springtime. The best shape I was ever in for climbing was after a season of backcountry skiing. Just all that time hiking and hauling shit around and like being out there all day prepares you so well for big wall climbing.
Mm.
But the things that I didn't do is I wasn't loading my fingers as regularly as I should have. I would be kind of tired and I would go to the gym maybe twice a week. But in some cases, the winters were epic and I wouldn't really climb at all because I was so psyched to ski. But for athletes that want to like and do that, that's totally fine. Priority number one, though, is to keep loading your fingers regularly. And it doesn't need to be anything special. It doesn't need to be anything really that progressive. It just needs to be done all the damn time. And that's something that's not that fatiguing, that should be okay to do at home on a fingerboard. And what that will set people up for when they get back to climbing in the springtime again is their skills and their fitness will really pay off because their fingers will be strong again. And so that's a really common mistake that I see, whether it's for skiing or any other thing. Taking long periods of time off, it's a good thing, but getting some mechanical stress to the connective tissues is still really important.
I often make the analogy of like a vehicle and its tires and a climber and our fingers, because all of the abilities that we have are ultimately limited by very, very little friction, or very, very little square inches of friction on our fingers. And you can have the most powerful vehicle, and if the tires are bald, it won't matter. You won't be able to perform. You won't be able to drive fast. You can't corner well. You won't be safe in wet weather because you just can't stick to the road. Climbing is really like that, and it's frustratingly like that in a lot of ways, where you can be very explosive and very strong, but if you don't have the fingers to keep you onto the rock, it doesn't matter. And going back to what we were saying originally, yeah, in a lot of ways, climbing is natural. Climbing is something that's been a part of the human movement repertoire since, 7.5 million years. It's our original movement. But the finger part of the equation, that is totally new. We're like 2 generations of human beings into the idea of finger training. And so, unless your parents were really serious rock climbers, you have 0 inherited finger adaptations to allow you to climb hard. So
yeah, even those ancestors, they were still loading their fingers, hanging on to things more, right? So as soon as we reduce that for, I would say, even a month, like we lose density in the connective tissues. Therefore, when athletes want to get back, they've lost a lot of the potential for the adaptations that they've been training for. And so, for whatever reason, like, you want to keep that stimulus, because no stimulus is like rock climbing for the fingers. And so athletes that want to do that, and the gym, in a lot of cases, when I was doing what I described, I was doing, climbing steep 512 at the gym is not that hard on your fingers. It might be pumpy on your forearms, but it is not physically that much intensity on the fingers. That's not a necessary or helpful way, in my opinion. You'd be much better off. That's the hallmark of a fingerboard, in my opinion. Periods when people are not going to the gym regularly and they really need that stimulus.
I thought there was something interesting that you said that really resonates with me, which was that, like, hey, you don't, that sort of year-round hangboarding habit, which I admittedly very much struggle with, but I see the importance of. You said it doesn't need to be very fancy, and you said it doesn't even need to be progressive. And I thought that's actually like a really important thought, and a really important barrier that people have to hangboarding is, I don't know how to do it. I mean, I've read like 4 different or 12 different methods of doing it. And what I've really come to conclude from, just being in the science of tendon training for a long, long time is that we are probably less sensitive to loading intensity than we are to loading frequency. And if you are loading your fingers in some way, if you're pulling on your fingers, ideally for more than a few seconds, more than about 3 or 4 seconds, that's going to be the most important thing. And sometimes getting hung up on, like, well, should it be 8 seconds and what millimeter edge, and should I, attach something to my waist? Should I do one arm? Like, those are all good questions, but ultimately, like, if you load your fingers and you do it regularly, even if you do it in a variety of different ways, a variety of different hold types, you're going to be triggering the mechanisms that are at work in your body to start laying down new fiber, thickening up that tissue, and ultimately making it more resilient to injury,
Yeah.
as well as contributing performance.
I usually tell people to like keep it as specific and simple as possible. Think about climbing a 512 route. If your 512 route is steep and it has 30 hand moves, you're going to do something on 5 to 7 seconds on a board. You're going to use a relatively big edge. Body weight is probably plenty of intensity because that's harder than the rock climb is going to be. And if you can do reps until your muscles are fatigued and you do 3 of those in a session, that's enough, in my opinion. Like if you're during off-season kind of training, program. But that stimulus is not going to happen in any other method unless you do it on a fingerboard, or on another method down the wall, whatever. But you get what I'm saying.
Yeah. Really good. Really good. And then my last one was really like the breakthrough in my own climbing, which was barrier to 512 being no movement training. I think that, when we think about climbing, when we think about the sensations of climbing, we think about the fatigue. And so we counter that with strength. And we think that, like, last time I went rock climbing, the move was either too hard for me to do or it was too many moves for me to do in a row. And I experienced that as fatigue. So I'm going to resolve that with strength. And that works to a point, but really only to a point. And what I've really come to terms with in my climbing is that no matter how much strength you have, no matter how much endurance you have, like even for, say, Jonathan Siegrist, strength and endurance are a limited resource and they will run out. Even the strongest climbers on the planet have limited amounts of those things. And what they do better than the rest of us is they are so much more efficient with how they spend their money, their endurance money, their strength money than we are. And when I watch great climbers, I'm like, yeah, it's not just that you've got more of it, it's that you're spending it so much more wisely. You are spending so much less time under tension than I am. I always watch like old Chris Sharma videos, and you watch when Sharma's setting up for a huge huck, and then you watch him latch the hold, and you watch that whole like 8-second sequence, and you notice that like for 90% of that, he was under so little tension, and then he just applied tension right when he needed it, right where he needed it, and then he released it and sags onto the hold as soon as he stuck it. And that's so different than how, your 5'11", 5'12" climber operates, myself included. Like, we're all spending our chips way too freely when actually we don't have enough to spend. And the solution to that, the one thing that is infinite, is movement. Endurance is limited, strength is limited, but movement is unlimited. And when you start really being able to identify ways to train movement that don't involve climbing, because climbing is not like basketball. You can't just do it any Tuesday night. Well, I'll tell you, for us, like in Jackson, like, you really can't do it. Like, it's very, very hard to get to rock climbing. We have no gyms. We have no nearby crags. Climbing is something you get to do infrequently. So if the only movement training that you do is only when you rock climb, then you can only improve your movement, which is the single most important and most valuable, lowest hanging fruit in your climbing, and that's just not frequent enough. So that's really been my passion, is developing movement training programs that you can do on the floor with no equipment, that really help you rehearse the patterning of how your body operates in a quadrupedal movement environment. And that's what is so unique about climbing, is it's quadrupedal, right? We're using all 4 limbs, whereas most of the way that we live our life in the horizontal world, we're operating in a bipedal way, just relying on our 2 feet. And that's a whole different patterning for the brain that we can rehearse through crawling movements and other movements that are a big part of our training approach, that for me is completely transformed the way I move, not just grade wise, but just in terms of like my mindset, my my thought process now so much more around how can I solve this problem versus how hard can I squeeze this hold.
I love it. The other thing that makes me think about like the junk mileage that I talk about with climbers is if we're going to do climbing wall movement, you know, if we change the intensity too much regularly, we change the skill, we change the coordination, we change the movement. And so, you know, that ties in nicely with all of the things we've been talking about. But number one problem, I would say, is just doing intensity that's too easy for people and assuming that that skill and those movements will transfer to something that's harder, which is exactly not how movement works, because it all has a timing and a velocity and a coordination and a direction. And so, yeah, that works, you know, well into what we're talking about as like getting rid of the things that aren't really helping people reach their goals of, you know, climbing that next level.
Yeah. Well, sweet. Tyler, that's been super fun.
Yeah,
Really,
man. Nice to see you. Always good to chat. I wish that I had more free time to go on climbing trips. I would definitely come to Jack's. But I think I talked to you. I'm gonna split board this year.
We did talk about that, and I'm very, very much considering that as well. But whether I do or not, you've got to come up to Jackson and pow surf with me, because I guarantee you'd lose your mind.
Okay, sick. I want to for sure. I'm getting competent on the board, so I will do it for sure.
I mean, you don't even have to feel like you got to be competent. It's just like a skateboard without wheels. We do it in POW, low angle terrain. It's
my God, so fun. Yeah. Does it float well? Is it like, how big's the board? Skateboard?
It's about the size of a snowboard.
Oh, so it is bigger. Okay.
Yeah, just no bindings.
Okay, sick. That sounds fun.
Yeah, so fun.
For the movement skill for that, like I've learned to skate recently, and it's been mind-blowing for me to see how quickly we learn stuff, because I haven't learned a new skill in a long time, and it's been really cool to see how plastic our brains are for that kind of stuff. So that's been like my fun, is relearning how adaptable and plastic we really are.
I think that's so great. That's 100%. It's been really fun to watch you do that. My son has just gone over the rails with skateboarding this summer. So I'm seeing what that bug looks like. And yeah, man, evolving, learning new things, subjecting ourselves to places where, you know, we're uncomfortable and unfamiliar. You cannot replicate that learning curve in things that you're good at. So like, go and try things that you're not, because learning, evolving, growing, that's the spice of life. That stuff is so fun.
For sure.
Right on. You guys, thanks so much. We had great attendance throughout. If you have any questions, I'm going to try to figure out how to post this thing in a way that, like it's all recorded and everything. So you can always hit us up in the comments, and Tyler and I'll happily jump in with our thoughts. But thanks for joining. And one more time, Nelson20 is the discount code for the 512 training plan. And that's only valid for 12 hours till midnight tonight. So thanks for rallying, you guys, and we'll see you soon.
Sick, bro. Cheers.